This radio program intended for informational purposes only. The information does not constitute legal advice. The law constantly changes. The information may not be complete or correct depending on the date and your particular legal problem. Each legal problem depends on its individual facts, and different jurisdictions have different laws and regulations. Because of that, you should not act or rely on any information in this segment without seeking the advice of a competent attorney licensed to practice law in your jurisdiction for your particular problem. There's one of those sitting right across from me right now, and his name is Marshall Chriswell. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us here today.
Nice to be here.
So we hear this term, statute of limitations, and we hear it applied in a number of different ways and to a number of different, generally criminal activities. But it's a really broad term that has a lot of different applications, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. A statute of limitations it impacts both criminal law and civil law. It impacts pretty much any kind of a legal action that you're going to bring. And what it is, in a nutshell, is a law, generally a statute that's been passed by the legislature, that limits the amount of time that you have to bring a certain cause of action. So if you've suffered an injury, some sort of damage, the law says, all right, you can't just wait an extremely long amount of time and then come and bring this lawsuit. It's got to be done within a certain amount of time. And that amount of time, that time frame is different depending on what kind of a case it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about it from the civil law standpoint, because I think that probably is a little bit less known than what we hear in the more sensationalized criminal law proceedings.
Yeah, and statute of limitations applies to any civil action. If you, for instance, if you have a contract with someone, whether it's a written contract or an oral contract, someone owes you money, somebody's breached an obligation that they have to you in an agreement, Pennsylvania law says that you have 4 years from the date of the breach to bring the action. In a tort case, a personal injury case, or a case for property damage, you only have 2 years to file a case. Medical malpractice, you have 2 years to bring a case from the date that you discover your injury, from the date that you discover or you reasonably should have known that you suffered an injury from medical malpractice. So there are all of these different types of cases, and the legislature has said, okay, these are the time frames that are appropriate to each one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of those things that you just mentioned sort of gives me the idea that the laws for statute of limitation are in place to protect a number of different parties, but one of those is to protect somebody from having someone hold something over them for a period of years or even for their entire lives.
Absolutely. It is. They are there to protect potential defendants in lawsuits from exactly what you said. From being under fear that a lawsuit could be filed against them indefinitely. Mm-hmm. So the statute of limitations, it's a defense to a lawsuit, and it is pretty much the strongest defense that you can bring. If someone files a suit and it's outside of the statute of limitations, the strongest defense that you can bring is they shouldn't have even been able to file it in the first place. Mm-hmm. because it was past the statute. So it's very strong protection for defendants.
There are cases that I'm thinking in criminal terms here where a case is decided from a criminal standpoint and a defendant is found not guilty, but then a civil lawsuit is filed for wrongful death or for whatever the crime might have been,
sure,
where it crosses from criminal to civil. Talk about statute of limitations within those confines.
The statute of limitations applies equally whether there has been a corollary criminal action or not. So in the civil case, if this is a wrongful death action, a tort action, you're still going to be dealing with the same statute of limitations as you would whether the whether the state decided to prosecute a criminal case. And there are wrongful death actions that have a criminal component and some that don't. Some are negligent behavior that maybe don't rise to a criminal action, but it's a civil case. And it doesn't matter whether there's that criminal case or not. There's still that same statute of limitations.
Okay. We're talking with Marshall Chriswell today, and the subject is the statute of limitations. You mentioned Pennsylvania's strictures, what the laws are for Pennsylvania and the statute of limitations. That sort of implies that in other states it can be different and maybe in some cases vastly different.
It certainly can. Every state has different laws, and these, like I said, these statute of limitations provisions are generally set in statutes. They're in statutory law. So the state legislature has set those, and they can be widely different. It's interesting. I think one thing that's interesting to talk about is, the statute of limitations. What does that mean? So if you have 4 years to bring an action on a breach of contract, what do you actually have to do before that 4 years runs? Do you have to send a letter to the defendant saying, hey, I have this cause of action? Well, no, that's not going to work. Can you send an email? Can you no, you actually have to file a complaint in court, and if it's in the court of common pleas, which most cases are, you actually have to have at least attempted service on the defendant by the time that statute of limitations runs. So it's really important, and something that we're constantly as attorneys telling our clients is, you have this deadline coming. Once we've figured out, all right, what was the date that this injury or breach occurred, what statute of limitations applies to it, you have to get that case filed and at least service attempted. The sheriff has it for service by the date of that statute of limitations. So just because you've talked to an attorney by that date, or just because maybe you've sent a demand letter by that date, that doesn't count. You have to actually have the case filed. With
a deadline such as that, do you often get people who say, I'm under the gun here, I got to get this done, and then they try to rush something through?
Yes, that happens. That happens, and there are ways that you can preserve the statute of limitations. You can file because sometimes you get somebody who has a case that the statute of limitations is impending, it's coming up, and the case is pretty complicated, and it's going to take a little while to prepare the complaint, because in Pennsylvania you need to allege sufficient facts in your complaint, so sometimes you have to do some investigation and things, and so you're not going to have time to get that done by the statute of limitations expiration, but you can file what's called a writ of summons. So if you know what you're doing, you can file a writ of summons in the courthouse, have that served, and then file your full complaint later, and you can preserve the statute of limitations that way. So that's one way that we can help someone who's really under the gun with a deadline.
So as an attorney, your advice would be for people who come to you with a statute of limitations out there somewhere that maybe they're vaguely aware of but not absolutely certain, is you don't have to have the case absolutely nailed down in order to begin this action, but you need to be aware that once that deadline passes, you've got no chance.
You're out of luck. The statute of limitations has initials, the SOL for a reason, right?
Oh, geez, I don't believe that.
So you really need to be cognizant of it, and what we have always said in the past on this show, it just applies with as much force. It is, you get to an attorney as quickly as you can. If you think that you have a case and you want to pursue it, talk to an attorney, have a consultation as quickly as you can, so that if there are those issues with time, you can make sure to get in under the deadline.
Talking with attorney Marshall Chriswell today. The segment is called Marshal Law, and today we're discussing the statute of limitations. So what are some of the things that folks need to know in relation to the statute of limitations here in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think something else that's important to know is that there are some exceptions to the statute of limitations. So, for instance, I mentioned medical malpractice cases. So normally it's, for a tort case, if you suffer an injury, it's 2 years from the date. If you're in a car accident, 2 years from the date of that accident is when you need to file your case by. But there are exceptions. There can be instances where you're not aware that you've suffered an injury. Maybe you think you're okay, and then months or sometime later, that injury begins to manifest itself. There can be instances like that in property law. You buy a house, and there was a defect in the house that was actively concealed from you, fraudulently. The seller fraudulently concealed a defect in the house. And maybe it's with the plumbing or some other area of the home, the wiring that you wouldn't have discovered until boom, your house catches on fire or your sewage backs up. And then, you realize that, okay, maybe you're outside of a statute of limitations, but there was active fraud, and you may be able to argue to a judge that the statute of limitations should be, and the word for it is tolled, that the judge should toll the statute of limitations because you had no way of discovering that injury during the enumerated time. So, there are exceptions. So if you're hearing me and saying, oh, well, this guy says there's a 2-year statute of limitations on something, no, you always want to look into it a little further, because just like everything in the law, the answer when someone asks me a question is almost always, it depends.
Yeah,
it depends on the facts, and we usually need to take some time and look at it closely.
Well, the line that we use is each legal problem depends on its individual facts, and different jurisdictions have different laws and regulations.
Yeah, that's right, and that's not just a throwaway line. That's for real.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there is a statute of limitations on this program today, which means we're just about done. But for folks who want to learn more about your services, what do they need to do?
You can give me a call at 724-465-5826. Come see us in the Atrium Building in downtown Indiana, or online at www.westernpalawyer.com.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks.